Welcome back to Red and Blue. I'm Robert Costa. Republican Congressman George Santos says he will remain in office, despite a growing number of calls for him to resign. The New York representative is under intense scrutiny for his biography, and officials in Nassau County spoke out against him at a press conference Wednesday.
He has no place in the Nassau County Republican Committee, nor should he serve in public service.
There is no way for the public to ever have faith in his word.
He's a national joke. He's an international joke. But this joke's got to go.
For more on the questions surrounding Congressman Santos, CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins us from Capitol Hill. Scott, great to have you here. What's the latest on this story?
It's hard to imagine, Bob, anyone at any place at any time having a first week on the job like George Santos of Long Island. Today, his fellow Republicans from Long Island, including some of his Republican colleagues here in the U.S. House, called for him to resign. That's one day after some of his colleagues from New York hand-delivered to his office a formal ethics complaint, which was one day after a formal complaint was filed with the Federal Election Commission about Congressman Santos's fundraising and financial disclosures after his first weekend on the job, in which he was sworn in the middle of the night and faced protests from some constituents back home. That's the reality on day 5, and there's no indication day 6 is going to get any better or any easier. Reporters asked Kevin McCarthy, the new U.S. House Speaker, if Santos should resign. Take a listen to what Speaker McCarthy had to say.
The voters elected him to serve. If there is a concern, he has to go through the ethics. We'll let him move through that. But right now, the voters have a voice in the decision. It's not where people pick and choose based upon what somebody's press has. So he will continue to serve.
It's also his other Republicans in Congress commenting today, in part because so many of us are asking so many of them questions, probably not pleased with this distraction as they're trying to legislate. Here's what other Republicans told us late today.
When you have your local party saying something so vocally, that's not a helpful sign.
He's been elected by his folks, and he'll have to deal with his issues with the Ethics Committee.
I've been clear in public in that, I think there's some legitimate concerns being raised about how he conducted himself during the campaign. And it was up to me.
And Speaker McCarthy wouldn't rule out the possibility of Santos sitting on committees. And of course, the House Speaker is pivotal to getting Santos on committees. And we expect to hear new protests once his assignments are announced, with the concern that George Santos, who has so many unanswered questions, whose ties to others in power is murky at best right now, might get sensitive information as a member of a formal congressional committee.
What a story, Scott. Where does it all go from here?
At this point, I think the next big question is, how long can he sustain this? Because the scrutiny is quite something, Bob. We spent a lot of time outside his office in the Longworth House office building since Saturday. Every time he comes and goes, there's this press pack that pursues him with baseline questions like, are you going to stay? Why don't you tell us what your story is? Can you explain the lies you've told? How long can he sustain that reality before one of two things happens? He decides it's just too much, or he finally sits down and gives extended answers to a national audience, or at least to his New York 3rd Congressional District, about the many questions and, Bob, the growing new questions.
What about the Republican Party on Capitol Hill? We heard from Congressman Patrick McHenry of North Carolina. We heard from Speaker Kevin McCarthy. But what about, Scott, the rank-and-file members who are inside the House and are now having to deal with questions about Congressman Santos?
Anytime you're a member of Congress, you don't want to get questions that aren't germane to you. And George Santos' questions are not really the doing of his colleagues. They're not their fault, and it's not their responsibility to answer the questions. I can say, without equivocation, this is a distraction during a pivotal moment for a new majority. They are on the floor this week putting out all their big messaging bills, their first bills out of the gate, the things they want to shout from the rooftops about. And instead, a lot of our airtime's being consumed by George Santos. A lot of questions to them are about George Santos, not about the abortion bills passed today, not about the weaponization of the federal government committee they approved yesterday and wanted to talk about. So there's a frustration and a fatigue with all things George Santos among the the Republican staffers who are with these Republican members.
Scott, if Congressman Santos did decide at some point to resign and step away, how would that affect the House majority in terms of the numbers and the politics?
That's the trickiest part, Bob, because it's a very narrow majority, as we all have learned over the past week and a half, and it's a fragile majority for Kevin McCarthy, one in which George Santos is a McCarthy supporter. To lose him, to lose that seat, makes a narrow majority even narrower, makes a more difficult trajectory for the House to do the things it wants to do. And to be clear, this district was and remains uniquely competitive for Democrats, perhaps much more so now that George Santos has experienced the experience he's had over the past week.
Scott MacFarlane, thank you for your reporting.